Welcome back to day 2 of Indyfest 2021. I'm John Ralston, the editor of the Nevada Independent. Later on today, in just a couple of hours, you are going to be seeing exclusive poll results on the 2 most important races in Nevada in 2022, the governor's race and the Senate race. And the governor's race will have primary and general election matchups. And before that, our amazing gaming reporter Howard Stutz and I will be interviewing 2 leaders of the gaming industry, Bill Hornbuckle, the chairman and CEO of MGM Resorts, and Bill Miller, who is the head of the American Gaming Association. Really looking forward to that panel. But first, we're in for a real treat, and we are honored to have with us the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, I hope you are with us via Zoom.
Nice to be with you.
So I think people really appreciate the fact that you're with us, considering how busy it must be back in Washington with the infrastructure bill still in limbo, and you're a new parent. Have you been sleeping at all, sir?
Not really. Turns out they're on their schedule, not ours. But obviously, it's joyful work.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. You know, I was thinking, Mr. Secretary, there's been so much media attention on your new parenthood. I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are, in this country when a gay couple with 2 new children, it's not even news.
Yeah, hopefully it'll come to be pretty unremarkable, but it's a remarkable thing in our lives. It's everything that everybody says it'll be. It's turned our world upside down, and just a beautiful thing. We've been really thankful for just all the supportive and kind and encouraging words. We didn't originally know that it would be twins, so we're having double the joy, double the work, and it's just an amazing thing. And of course, a lot of human infrastructure going on around this household that has me thinking about some of the issues of the day in a whole new way, too.
Well, thank goodness that they are too young to really understand what's going on in Washington right now over the infrastructure bill, Mr. Secretary, because I don't think anyone does who doesn't pay attention to this in a granular way. The deadline has just been pushed back again to October 31st. I mean, is this really a pipe dream that this bill is ever going to pass, sir?
It's going to pass. It needs to. First of all, America needs these improvements. Secondly, America wants these improvements. And it's one of the few things, at least with regards to the transportation infrastructure, the things that we're focused on in my department, that commands a lot of bipartisan support. It's why we saw that bipartisan deal in the Senate in a day and time in Washington where you don't see that happen very much. And it's why I believe that we're going to get there as well. We're talking about one of the most ambitious things ever done in America to our transportation infrastructure. An ambition, I would argue, that meets the need that's in front of us. But nevertheless, something that is, of course, incredibly complex, has a lot of pieces to it. And for that reason, shouldn't be surprising that there's going to be some procedural complexities, too. But we've got to get it done. And I'm very confident that we will. And as soon as we do, that's where my department really has a whole new set of responsibilities on top of everything that of course, we're responsible for now to make sure that those taxpayer dollars are well spent. I mean, we're talking about the biggest investment in public transit we've ever had as a country. We're talking about the most we've done for passenger rail since Amtrak was stood up in the first place. Almost unprecedented levels of investment across the different modes of transportation. And that's going to be a tall order and a responsibility that the many people in the Department of Transportation, I think, are excited and ready to step up and fill.
You used the phrase procedural complexities. You are a master of the euphemism, sir, because this is being held up by internal factionalism in the Democratic Party. People are seeing these numbers. I think ordinary Americans, $1 trillion, $2 trillion. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. You remember that? Everett Dixon saying he was talking about billions. I mean, I think people are having a hard time wrapping their arms around this, Mr. Secretary, because of those big numbers, even though I think you could argue, and I think forcefully, that the individual parts of this are things that most Americans would say in a poll if they were asked, yeah, I'm all for that.
I think that's right. You know, the image that's been coming to mind lately, especially when the debate is only about numbers, is I imagine a guy walking into a restaurant and the menu comes and he tears off the left half of the menu and just looks at the prices. and comes time to order and says, I'm going to have the $13.95 plus the $24 followed by the $7, with no regard to whether he's ordering a cocktail or a bowl of ice cream or a steak. And that's how it sometimes feels to me when the conversation is so focused on the numbers that it gets away from what we're out to deliver. Of course, these are big sums of money, and it's important that they be tracked carefully and spent well. But the bottom line is actually about what we can deliver on the overall Build Back Better agenda. That's things like, again, a topic very much on my mind lately, which is the importance of getting everybody 12 weeks of parental leave. What it would mean to make sure that every American could count on pre-kindergarten, affordable child care, in-home senior care. But then on the stuff I work on, pulled some numbers just to look at Nevada's slice alone. And, in Nevada, you've got more than 1,000 miles of highway in poor condition, which, by the way, is actually pretty good comparatively, because a lot of that is relatively new by U.S. standards, but obviously needs work. And you could expect over $2 billion for federal highway aid programs, another 200 plus million for bridge replacement, knowing that we need that. Transit's playing a huge role both for workers in Nevada and just knowing the importance of the tourism economy. And of course, this is a story that's being replicated across the country. So yes, these are big numbers, and big numbers deserve a big level of scrutiny. But let's not drift away from what it is that those big numbers are on the table for, which is to deliver things that America needs in order to win the 21st century.
You mentioned that number, $2 billion coming to Nevada, and we appreciate both of you knowing that number and pronouncing the name of the state correctly, Mr. Secretary. But seriously, I guess what I'm wondering is people are going to think, okay, we're going to get $2 billion. Where is that money going to go? Who would decide, assuming the bill passes with that $2 billion in it, which again is a big assumption right now. But if we get $2 billion, where does that money go? Who makes the decisions?
Yeah, so a lot of this goes out through formulas, and that's one of the reasons why we can offer a reasonable prediction of at least what the minimum amount would be on something like the highway dollars. Some of it goes into discretionary grants. So actually, the last time I saw you in person, last time we were in Nevada, was to discuss an infra grant award of almost $40 million to make safety improvements. There's a stretch of the Boulder Highway. It's been, unfortunately, the site of a lot of pedestrian fatalities. About 10% of the state's pedestrian fatalities happening on this one corridor. And local leaders have stepped up, and your congressional delegation advocated for there to be dollars going into it. And so over and above the formula money that comes in, we were able to use our discretionary dollars as a department to direct funding for those safety improvements. Those pots get bigger will get bigger when this bill is passed. We had about, I think, $7 worth of requests for every $1 we were ready to give out or able to give out in the program as it stands. And so we know the need is there. As a former mayor, I really trust local communities to put forward ideas that are going to make a lot of sense to them. And what I love about having both discretionary and formula dollars is that we not only are able to create some predictability through those formulas that decide, for example, a baseline of highway funding, but also make some hands-on intentional decisions about the best ideas coming from communities in Nevada and everywhere else that are going to make streets safer, that are going to help get ahead of the climate challenge. They go to equity, which, by the way, cannot be separated from public transit. I mean, if you look at the racial dimension alone and how much more likely non-white households or workers or families are to rely on public transit, there's some issues of racial and economic justice that are part of this too. And so we're excited about what people are putting forward, but Washington doesn't have to come up with all the answers, but we should definitely be coming up with more of the money. And that's what we'll be able to do when this bill passes.
Yeah, I mean, you were out here, excuse me, for an event a few weeks ago on this so-called Reimagine Boulder Highway project. And I can tell you, anybody who's lived here for any length of time, Mr. Secretary, has reimagined Boulder Highway in better shape. But even that $40 million grant, let's be clear to people, that doesn't pay for much more than a third of that entire project over the long haul, right?
Yeah, there's always going to be a match, especially on some of these challenge or discretionary grant programs between local and federal. But again, I can tell you as mayor, former mayor, a lot of times we needed more help from Washington, more resources, as well as things like technical assistance. And let's remember, we're also standing up programs that weren't there before. So in addition to supercharging things we've already had, like the infra grant program or another one, called RAISE, which used to be known as Tiger during the Obama administration. We've also got to do things that just weren't on the table even 10 or 20 years ago, like building out an electric vehicle charging network. America is, I don't have to tell Nevadans, the extraordinary capacity that American workers have and the American auto industry has to generate the EVs that are going to prepare us for a better climate future and save families a lot of money. But we need to build out a charging network. Nevada's slice of that would be $38 million over 5 years to build that charging network across the state. These are things we've never really undertaken before as a country, but that's what we're going to need to do moving forward. Same thing with the internet access. Still far too many Americans live without an internet subscription. I'd say that's just as important as interstate highway connection in order to be able to thrive. You got to do both, and we're going to connect that up in a bill that thinks through infrastructure in broad terms.
It's interesting because Nevada is this state with these two large urban areas separated by this gigantic expanse. And Nevada is obviously a state that thrives on tourism, needs tourism to survive, needs all those cars coming in from California on Interstate 15, a widening of I-15, which, by the way, an old friend of mine, Steve Sebelius, wrote about today at the RJ. We've been hearing about that for decades. We've been hearing about the I-11 project. Phoenix and Las Vegas are the two of the largest cities without an interstate connector. The ultimate build out of that, Mr. Secretary, would have an interstate going from Las Vegas to Reno, which I think a lot of people in this state have been waiting for a long time. And by the way, I don't expect you to have granular knowledge of these things, but I'm talking about Nevadans and what they would expect from something like this. We've been hearing about this for decades and decades. It doesn't seem like now is the time that we're going to get that with the polarization in Washington. Tell us why we should be optimistic, Mr. Secretary.
What's the beautiful thing about transportation infrastructure is it's one of the few things that isn't as polarized in Washington. And we experienced that when we were certainly in the thick of it this spring and summer, as I was on the phone with Republican and Democratic members of both chambers talking about how to get this done. And you should know, by the way, that your delegation has seen to it that I have a pretty granular knowledge of things like I-11. I don't think I was in office more than a day or two before Senators Cortez Masto and Rosen cornered me, ganging up with their Arizona counterparts too, to go over where the environmental impact statement was and everything to get that done. Because of course it's such importance to the state. And again, here's the thing I've noticed about every member of Congress, no matter how conservative or liberal they are, they're all from somewhere. And wherever you're from, there's a big need, whether it's a newer, high growth state with a lot of tourism like you have in Nevada, or whether it's a place with a lot of legacy crumbling infrastructure. We were in tunnels in New York and New Jersey that hundreds of thousands of train passengers go through, any one of which, if it went down, would cause ripple effects in the economy so big you'd feel them all the way out in Nevada. And they're more than 100 years old. They're the best state-of-the-art technology from 1910. And so every part of the country has a story to tell. And every member I talk to, even if they're at each other's throats on some of the other issues, sees the need to get something big done.
I'm pleased to see that some of our very smart audience has put some questions in the chat, and it really is a testament to the folks who read the Indy and are here today. Let me just give you a couple of those, Mr. Secretary. The western 60% of the country has geographic impediments. This is a great point. Numerous mountain ranges, long distances between major cities, as I just mentioned, with small communities in between. What would the infrastructure bill do to improve the movement of people, goods, and services to this geography? Is it only improvement of roads? What else is there?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important point that every region has its unique needs and its unique opportunities. A lot of interesting conversations going on about the different forms of transit, rail even, in addition to things like the highway opportunities and projects we were discussing. Another thing I'd point out is that the more stretched out you are, the more important it is to be intentional about that EV charging network, right? If you're in a densely populated community where maybe it's also suburban and most people live in standalone houses, then people can charge their vehicle at home. Your charging infrastructure is just the plug in your wall, and you're going to be able to get easily to and from where you're going. When you're out west, these ranges that seem very big on electric vehicles, 200, 300, 400 miles, still require some intention if you're going to be able to get through, depending on your line of work, get through your day and not ever have any anxiety about being able to charge. So that's one example of something that needs to be customized. And we've been working with the Department of Energy to create what are called alternative fuel corridors, where we actually map out where on the national highway network the different charging stations need to go, because it looks different if you're out west and you got places that are few and far between than it does in a different part of the country. I think when you talk to folks in the West, there's a particular understanding of the direct, in-our-face nature of the consequences of climate change. And whether we're talking about wildfires, whether we're talking about drought, this is an issue that I think is not theoretical for anyone living in this part of the country. And one more reason why there's a sense of urgency to get something done. Transportation, this has been on my mind, especially as we head into November and the international climate talks scheduled to take place in Glasgow. As you look at the road to that event and the commitments that the countries are going to make, including what the president has led our country to commit to, beginning with his climate summit that he convened in April. In our economy, transportation is the #1 biggest greenhouse gas emitting sector of the economy. And to me, that means we've got to be a big part of the solution. And again, I think there's some uniquely, both on the harm side and on the opportunity side, in a state blessed with, for example, the solar resources that you all have in Nevada, a lot specifically for the West to look at here.
It's interesting because you brought up climate a few times. I'm going to get to a couple other questions from our viewers in a second, but since you raised that now, I wanted to talk to you about it. When you ran for president, before you ran for president, now, there is still so much. And by the way, I think it's unscientific and silly division about climate change, that the people can't get on the same page. The wildfires out here obviously were related in some way to climate change. Again, I know you are the secretary of being sunny as well, but how can you be optimistic that we're going to actually have a real conversation that can lead to implementation on that issue?
Well, there's no question that it's an enormous challenge. It's perhaps the biggest challenge facing humanity in my lifetime. But I think for precisely that reason, we can and must step up to do something about it. What excites me about the transportation piece is we see where a lot of that's going to come from. We see it in electric vehicles, which are, I think, one of the best places to break the old false choice of climate versus jobs and demonstrate that we can create jobs through climate action. And it's good business, which you can tell as a lot of the most famous, long-standing, storied names in U.S. auto manufacturing are right alongside the startups and the more tech-oriented companies leaping into this electric future. But it's not just about the pieces of technology. It's about the questions of how we even design our systems and our cities. Can we organize our cities in ways that are more climate smart? And a lot of that's transportation, making it easier to get around, safe if you have a car, but also easy and safe if you don't have a car. Far too many Americans have to drag 2 tons of metal with them to get from point A to point B, who just as soon would benefit from having an alternative. And so what excites me is the scale of the solutions, even as we're facing the scale of the problems. But look, there's no sugarcoating the level of urgency here. We got this last round of warnings from the scientists a few weeks ago. This is just in my lifetime. And I remember this being discussed when I was in middle school, when it really was kind of like a controversial issue, but something science class was starting to talk about. And it went from this prediction to a theory to an observation to an emergency in a matter of a couple of decades. And now that I'm, even though I feel like it wasn't that long ago I was in school, now that I'm staring into the eyes of my kids, I'm thinking in a whole new way about just how important it is that we solve this before all of the consequences are on their plate.
Another question we have, Mr. Secretary, and we hear this complaint here in Las Vegas a lot about local public transportation, and especially how it does not do enough for the state's disabled population. Is there anything in this infrastructure bill that's going to help local entities be better about transporting the state's disabled population?
Yeah, this is really important. It's a very important part of public transit. And while the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, has been on the books for a long time, The reality is accessibility is still a long way off for a lot of commuters. And it's often commuters with disabilities who rely the most on public transit. And so this is part of what we mean when we talk about equity being at stake and equity driving both the discretionary grants that we're going to be able to do more of if this bill gives us more funding, and some of the specific programs in there. And there's even more legislation ahead. Senator Duckworth is one of many leading on this issue in Washington, because this really is a question of fairness and justice for sure. It's also a question of economic opportunity and unlocking the contributions that people with disabilities can make if they can fully participate in the workforce, fully participate in their families and communities. So, you know, we've come a long way, but clearly there's a long way to go, both with public transit, which we can help with federal dollars, and I would add some of the new technologies coming online. You look at things like automated vehicles, and there's a lot of concern, and rightly so, make sure we get this right in terms of safety, in terms of regulation. But think about the potential that holds for Americans with disabilities, and you know, it's important and humbling to remember that anybody who does not view themselves as part of the disability community today very likely will age into it later on, and so everyone has a stake in doing a better job.
One other question I want to ask from our audience in the time that we have left, because I have a few of my own I still want to ask, is that what role can or will the Nevada's new state infrastructure bank, as well as other state infrastructure banks, play in modernizing our country's infrastructure, including so-called smart digital infrastructure projects, such as integrating 5G infrastructure technology with sensor-enhanced roadways, et cetera? I'm sure you're familiar with this. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, a moment ago I mentioned automated vehicles, and the truth is getting that technology right is only partly about what's on board the vehicle, the brain of the car, so to speak. A lot of it's actually about what's out on the roadway, and that's just one example of how different kinds of connectivity and technology are going to matter in our infrastructure. I think it's really encouraging to see the energy that is out there in Nevada and in a lot of our states that want to be leading the way on this. I think it's a smart play for economic development. I think you can attract a lot of the people who are working on the cutting edge of this by making commitments to invest early. And it's something that we don't want to prescribe from Washington. We don't want to be, obviously we have some basic safety concerns, but we don't want to be creating all of the parameters for where these innovations are going to go. It's precisely why it's exciting to see states move forward, and then we find ways to be supportive from our position in Washington.
So I want to get back to the infrastructure bill and what's going on there and get to the so-called procedural complexities. I'm going to keep going back to that. It's the best euphemism I've ever heard about how Washington works, Mr. Secretary. I imagine that every night, correct me if I'm wrong, there's some kind of phone call between you and the president where you are cursing the names of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Tell us the truth. That is going on, isn't it?
No, what you have are a lot of conversations about how we can pull this thing together. Look, we've got obviously 535 members of the House and the Senate. We've got a party with slim majorities. And we've got this agenda item that's so compelling for the entire country and that the president's leading on, but that I don't think anybody should have expected would be simple. And you know, I don't know what folks would consider to be swift for aligning and cementing a multi-trillion-dollar generational investment, but we know that there are going to be twists and turns along the way, and we also know that we've got to get it done.
But I mean, you're frustrated, aren't you? And the president is frustrated. At first, he wasn't going to tie the two bills together. Now he's agreed with the progressives that they should be. It seems like when you can have two senators holding up this entire process, whether that's right or not, it's got to be frustrating for you. You came into this job. You really want to get this passed. As you mentioned, the massive scope of this scale has become compared to what FDR did and what LBJ did. It's got to just express your frustration here to Nevadans.
I'm here to express my excitement about getting this thing done. This is going to make such a big difference in all of our lives, and we'll be looking back on it, I think, for the rest of my life if we're able to achieve this. And look, I'm sure every president, just like every mayor, I know I felt this way when I was mayor, wishes when you put your agenda together that you put it forward and everybody says yes, and it's easy. Nothing about this is easy, and we shouldn't expect that with something of this scale and of this importance. But what's really amazed me in a divided country, in a polarized Washington, is to see ultimately how much, almost astonishing levels of agreement that there are on both the transportation infrastructure element, the need to fix our roads and bridges and do better with everything from airports to ports in this country, as well as the so-called social side of things. The unbelievable popularity of the idea of making sure everybody has paid family leave like people in the rest of the world do, or making sure community college and pre-K is affordable and childcare is affordable. Getting more people more healthcare, making sure that we fund it by asking the wealthiest to pay their fair share, and getting corporations that have sometimes paid zero on billions of dollars of profits to step up. These are things that there's remarkable level of consensus on among the American people because it's good policy.
I just have a few more questions. You've been so gracious with your time on a Sunday, Mr. Secretary. Just a few more. The airlines, which come under your purview, they have suffered tremendously during the pandemic. They were not on great financial footing even before the pandemic. Airline travel has changed so much for so many people. I'm going to test your relentless optimism, but is airline travel ever going to be the same? Are we going to see more consolidation of airlines? What's your take on that?
So, like you said, the aviation sector has been through an incredibly tough period, and yet here it is, and it's stepped up in so many important ways, transporting people, transporting PPE and goods, and in so many other ways, keeping our country moving. And this is one of the reasons why it was important to the president right away with the American Rescue Plan to make sure the dollars were in there. And I know we're naturally talking about the next bill and the next big thing and the next mountain to climb. But let's not forget that we're having this conversation within months of having passed what was already one of the most momentous things to happen in my lifetime in terms of Washington actually managing to get something done, and something that has had huge impact, from the child tax credit and what it's done to address child poverty, to the airport and airline support. It's part of why one of the best moments in my early days in this office was after the rescue plan got passed, and we heard that the airlines were advising their flight attendants and other employees that they could tear up their furlough notices and not be worried about being laid off. What's the road ahead? Look, there's still a long way to go, obviously, for people to be comfortable taking to the skies in some cases, for all of the international pieces to get worked out, and a lot of unanswered questions about how the pandemic will forever change the way that we move, the way that business and leisure travel is shaped, the way that commuting is shaped. But there's no question that human beings want and need to go to different places and be around other human beings. And so when you look at the energy and the commitment and the innovation of our aviation sector, I think it's going to be an incredibly fertile time in the years ahead. A few things that I've been talking a lot with leaders in that sector about, in addition to making sure that we just cement the process of getting them back on their feet. One of them is climate, right? It's pretty obvious how to make a car zero emissions. It's not as obvious how to do that on an airplane, but we have what's called sustainable aviation fuels, which are in many ways in their infancy, but will get a lot more support to make sure that the life cycle of our jet fuels is reducing or at least less carbon intensive. So that's one. Climate's one area. Another is what's called urban air mobility. And then if you look beyond airlines as we know them, to just our airspace in general, there's a lot of attention around commercial space travel, which is very exciting. But I would look a little closer to the ground for where some of the biggest things affecting our lives are going to be, which is drones making deliveries, drones perhaps moving larger cargoes and perhaps people in ways that have not been true in the past, and deconflicting that with an airspace that's already got a lot of planes coming and going. That's where our department comes in, and that's going to be exciting to watch too. Whether the existing legacy carriers get into that business or whether it winds up being separate, I think that's for smarter business minds than mine to think through. It'll be very exciting to watch and very important to make sure it unfolds well, which means safely and in a positive economic way for the country.
Just a couple more quick questions, Mr. Secretary, just pivoting off of aviation. An important aviation question here is, as you know, the renaming of McCarran International Airport to Harry Reid International Airport. The local county commission here has approved it. The FAA has even changed some of their maps, I think, and in response to that. But it's still not quite done. The process, again, is a little bit abstruse to people. Is it just a matter of the local funding coming through and it's a done deal? What else has to happen?
Yeah, so the decision is a local one, and where the FAA gets involved is things like air traffic control and maps, just a lot of different places where you got documents and charts. And my understanding is there's still a few steps coming through in terms of that documentation, but we're eager to move forward with that quickly. So that's my sort of Secretary of Transportation answer. My personal answer is just it's exciting to see, as somebody who got to know Senator Reid during my time running for office and bringing me through Nevada, and somebody who was just so helpful and quick to offer ideas and thoughts. And I experienced his famous efficiency on the telephone, and as well as just his wit and his intellect, and somebody I just admire even more now that I've got to know him some than I already did, watching him in his leadership role as I grew up.
Famous efficiency on the telephone. You are a master of the euphemisms today. He hung up on you without saying goodbye, didn't he?
I'll just say he never wasted 1 second on the phone, but he was also generous at this time.
Finally, sir, there is a new Amazon project coming out about your life, and there's been a preview released in which you were asked, of course, about running for president and being president. And you said, "I don't know. I know that I might be, and that's something." So you've already announced that you're running for president again.
Look, I have no idea if I'll ever run for office again in my life, but what I will say is it was an incredible experience and part of a road that brought me here to this incredible job. And if we are able to, as I'm confident we will, see this infrastructure plan through and then do a good job delivering it, then there will have been no better time in U.S. history to be Secretary of Transportation. So I'm excited as well as absorbed with the job at hand.
No announcement today for Nevadans at Indyfest 2021?
I think any news I have to make today is about my enthusiasm for getting this deal done. I really think it's going to happen. I can't say enough about how much a difference it'll make for Nevada, and look forward to being out there with hopefully giant ribbon-cutting scissors to celebrate some of the investments we can make.
Mr. Secretary, I know it's a Sunday. I know you're a very busy man, both personally and professionally right now. We really appreciate your coming on at Indyfest 2021. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. Thanks again.
Thank you. Great being with you.
And when we come back, we still have a couple of great things going on today at Indyfest 2021. We're just a little ways away from announcing our exclusive poll results. Who's ahead in the Senate and governor's race? But first, Howard Stutz and I are going to have a panel on online gaming with two industry leaders. Stick around.